government has an obligation to protect from third-party interests, it's very clear what those third-party interests are and who has gained from those third-party interests. So financial regulation, I think, is something that we all need to look at. And in terms of financial regulation, we also need to look at the role of the Federal Reserve. And what does the Federal Reserve do? The Federal Reserve in the United States has a dual mandate. And the dual mandate is to keep inflation low, but it is also to create employment. And so over the last 30 years, the same 30 years that created this huge inequality, we've seen that the mandate for low inflation take over the mandate for employment. Though recently the Federal Reserve's policy has been pushing for full employment, I think we need to look at it over time and also have the Federal Reserve in its policy be open and transparent. And I've said this before, and many have argued, you know, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency and it has to make monetary policy that's independent of political will of different administrations. Well, you could be independent, but you can talk about why you've done it and what the transparency and accountability to the public, and in whose interests are you making policy for. So those are the two kind of financial or monetary policy side that I talked to. And then the second is really in connection with what Ignacio said, is social expenditure and fiscal policy, right? These are all policy measures that governments take. And how can human rights talk about the ways in which fiscal policy is enacted? And I'd say the stimulus package that happened after the downturn in the economy was a very great first step. I would argue that one of the problems with that package was that a big part of it was for tax cuts and not for employment creation. And I think we need to also scrutinize what percentage of that stimulus money went for tax cuts that's not necessarily employment creation, but what actually went in and started jobs. And I would say that we need a lot more stimulus money, and we need to really create more jobs. And social expenditure money, and Ignacio's already said, over time, if you look, that social expenditure has stayed very steady state, if not decline, and that the kind of employment that's been created over the last 30 years have been not very good jobs. And so the level of unemployment, there's a lot of attention to how much unemployment, and the official statistic is, you know, 9-point-some% that are officially unemployed. That doesn't even take into account the people who are underemployed, which is around 16%. Those are people who have part-time jobs who would like full-time jobs. And that does not even count the people who've left the labor force because they haven't been able to find a job. So those numbers are not very accurate, but even those numbers are stark given where we are in terms of our economy. And in terms of the stimulus money or job creation of any kind, not just in terms of a crisis, one of the things that not enough attention is given to is what kind of jobs are created. And so the obligation for non-discrimination and equality in human rights has to do with job creation. So if there's money going towards job creation, is it going to, you know, the image of shovel-ready jobs? I mean, who do you think of when you think of someone with a shovel? You certainly don't think of a woman who might have 3 children to feed. And so we need to have the government really pay attention to the non-discrimination and equality in terms of job creation and the right to work. And when we talk about the right to work, again in the United States, we don't talk about what kind of work. And human rights, once again, gives us the tools to talk about the right to work and an adequate standard of living, and the work that the ILO has been doing in terms of decent work, which actually Norway brought up today from the floor. These are important milestones that we need to hold the government accountable to in terms of job creation policies. And, you know, why not, instead of shovel-ready jobs, we talk about increasing childcare, which will employ a great number of women in that industry, and also allow other women to leave their children in childcare so that they can go join the job force. And lastly, I'd say one of the arguments that economists have been making about this particular recession is that most of the jobs were lost by men. and therefore the job creation is addressing men. Well, more and more data is coming out now that says no, it's not actually men who've lost their jobs, and that you're seeing an entire secondary effect in terms of loss of jobs that are women and people of color, and how are those being addressed. And I will close with the fact that, going back to the financial sector, that the financial regulations that changed that allowed the banking industry to really create chaos in the whole world also created a system that poor people ended up getting houses that they couldn't afford and are now becoming homeless. And so it's the same kind of regulation, and the language that we've been using is the issue of biased regulation, because usually you talk about regulation and deregulation as though regulation is what some huge state sitting on your head, and deregulation is you're sort of free and running around. We say that it's not regulation versus deregulation, but it is a biased regulation in the interest of finance and not in the interest of workers.
Next, we have Agent Dike from the Human Rights Project of the Urban Justice Center.
Hi, thank you. Let's see, where to start.
It was very gratifying to see so many countries ask about economic and social rights during the review today. I have to say I was a little surprised. We've done a lot of lobbying and focusing on economic and social rights, but we didn't expect that so many countries would follow up with it, because so many people don't think of the United States as being an environment where we can even discuss implementation of economic and social rights. So, having said that, the response from the delegation was a little disappointing. The reason being that in the U.S. report, in the U.S. government's report for the UPR, it referenced FDR's for freedom speech and talked about using the phrase freedom from one. It would have been great to see mention of FDR's second speech on the Second Bill of Rights that talks more specifically about economic and social rights. We're not so naive to be having this side event and calling for ratification of the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, thinking that this will happen anytime soon. But we do think it's time to start a conversation and to start to push our government to recognize these vital rights that everybody needs to live in basic dignity. So let's see. I want to start by responding to the assertion by Mike Posner that the way the United States deals with its economic and social rights is through democratic solutions and civil society initiatives. And to say that, in essence, this approach hasn't worked. And it hasn't worked in particular for people who are most vulnerable to discrimination. So I'm talking about people of color, racial and ethnic minorities, in particular African Americans and Latinos when it comes to the world of employment. I'm talking about women, obviously necessarily children, people with disabilities, LGBT, especially LGBT youth of color. So it hasn't worked for so many people in the population. You can't respond by saying that we have economic policies that, what's the term, that a rising tide lifts all boats, that economic policies that benefit everybody, that will benefit even the most vulnerable amongst us just because they benefit everybody. That didn't happen during the Clinton years when we did see enormous growth in our economy. The disparity, the employment disparity between people of color and white Americans stayed the same, even during times of growth. So we don't accept that assertion.